70% of our citizens are either immigrants or they're the children or grandchildren of immigrants. So you have this melting pot of a society, and it's reflected in our culture.
This whole nation is created out of fighting for freedom, fighting for a place to call home. For me, I just have to ask God for extra grace to remember there's a reason that people are the way that they are and that they need to be freed with the love of Yeshua.
Welcome back to another episode of A Jew and a Gentile Discuss. I'm your co-host, Ezra Benjamin.
And I'm Carly Berna.
And we are, respectively, a Jew and a Gentile who both believe in Jesus and believe that there's value in looking at history as well as today's world and the headlines you see in the news through both a Jewish and a Christian lens. And today we're going to talk about immigration to Israel, a topic some of you listening may be very familiar with. Some of you may have extended family who have become citizens of the state of Israel, and others may have no idea what we're talking about and may be asking, why would you ever want to move to the Middle East when you have a perfectly good condo in an upscale part of Chicago or wherever you may be? But we're going to dive into that topic today. Specifically, Carly, people from, give or take a chunk of a generation, our generation, millennials, who made Aliyah, who immigrated to Israel. And joining us for this exciting topic are Michael and Vanessa Mistretta, who lead FIRM, which stands for Fellowship of Israel-Related Ministries, in downtown Jerusalem in Israel. And they themselves immigrated to Israel and became citizens a few years back. They're going to tell us their story today. But before we dive into that, I want to let you know that you, our listening audience, have an exciting opportunity to stand with and in Jesus' name to meet the practical needs of struggling Jewish communities in parts of the world you may never even have known Jewish communities exist. Places like Ethiopia, Zimbabwe, Northeast India, scattered throughout South America, and we could go on and on. But we want you to check out the details about that opportunity. It's all on our website, ajewandagentilediscuss.org. And as a thank you for your participation and for you standing with these communities with us, we want to get you some delicious, I'm drinking some right now, fresh roasted here in our hometown of Phoenix, Arizona, Ethiopian coffee. In fact, we want to give you the opportunity to enter into a drawing to win some free coffee from our very own coffee company, Lost Tribes Coffee. More details on that at the bottom of this episode, so please stick with us until then. But without further ado, Michael and Vanessa, welcome to the program. Thanks for joining us.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having us, guys.
Yes, thank you.
Well, let's dive right in and discuss. Guys, give us your elevator speech about your background. Pre-Israel, where did you grow up? Where are you from? What's your deal?
So I grew up in Canada, and as far as I knew, did not have a Jewish background. Grew up in the church, loved the Lord, wanted to make a difference with my life, thought I was going to go into business and send money to the missions field. Had no concept of Israel, never thought I'd end up in Israel, never wanted to go to Israel. So that's my starting point.
Yeah, and I grew up very different, a little confused because my mom grew up Catholic, my dad grew up Jewish, not a believer in Jesus. And he accepted the Lord when I was 7 years old. And so then we walked into Messianic Judaism, but there's a lot of confusion in regard to, am I a Christian? Am I Jewish? What am I? I have no idea what to actually walk out, how to explain this. It was very different. But I was born and raised in Florida, and home is still that's still the core of where my family is, and everybody's still there. And yeah.
So, Michael, you said that you never wanted to live in Israel, but Vanessa, did you want to live in Israel at some point in your journey?
Never. I never did. I even got invited to study abroad in Israel, and while I was in college, and my answer to that was, no, thank you. I am really happy in Florida. I'm good to go. And it really took God changing my heart, sometimes starting to wake up with this longing to go out of nowhere. And, the next semester I ended up landing in Tel Aviv and there for a study abroad for a semester. And it was just completely out of the blue. And then I ended that semester after absolutely hating my time. 6 months later, everybody said, oh, you need to move here because you're Jewish. You need to immigrate. And I was like, no, thank you. I'm an all-American girl. So see you later. And it just took a few years. God started to change my heart. But it was a process for me.
And I had a very different story and experience. I moved from Canada. I was on a 10-day fast, and God really grabbed a hold of my life and said, you're going to be living in, I'm sending you to Israel. I'm sending you to Jerusalem. And that was the last place I ever wanted to go. my answer was, God, I'm not one of those Israel-loving Christians. That just wasn't who I was. Send me to Africa, send me anywhere else in the world. Israel just wasn't on my radar. And I said, this is you, then you have to make this happen. I don't even know where to begin. And that sent me on a journey. I ended up selling my company, taking a trip out to Israel as a teenager, and just backpacked across the country. And I knew when I visited Israel for the first time, I knew this is my home. This is where I'm supposed to be. This is where I'm called. So we have a very different story in our first experience in Israel, coming to Israel. For me, I felt so much purpose, and kind of picked up, bought a one-way ticket, and moved to Israel after that.
So Vanessa, somewhat lackluster first experience in Israel, and Michael going, thinking, I'm going to live here. You feel like God's calling you there, but maybe weren't sure of the process for that. So you come back, Vanessa, you come back to the States, not so thrilled about what everybody in Israel is advising you to do to move there. And Michael, you come back to North America, ready to move to Israel. What were family reactions? What did friends say? Are they supportive of these thoughts and sentiments? Are they saying you're crazy? What are you doing? Speak a little bit to that.
Yeah, so I moved around a lot after college. And so the thought of potentially going at first, like I said, it was nowhere on my radar at all. And then it actually took a few years, and the same longing that I had felt when I got invited to study abroad was the same longing that I just started to wake up with these thoughts and missing Israel. And I just kept thinking, how do I miss a place that I didn't enjoy? This was just very, very weird to me. So then I just started taking trips, and I am such a process person that the thought of moving there was nowhere on my radar. It was hey, I'm going to go for a week. I'm going to go for 2 weeks. And then I started meeting people and getting friends and joining a congregation. And all of a sudden I was going once a year. And so then I knew a lot of people there. And so my family was very supportive of it. But the thought of moving there was nowhere on my radar, nowhere on theirs. And I remember just talking to them about my process. And once I finally got to a point where I thought, I really feel strongly from the Lord that I am supposed to become an immigrant. I am supposed to move there. I actually fought the Lord on it. And I did not want to say yes to that. But I really felt like that was a step of obedience for me to go. And so when I expressed that to my family, then obviously they're going to want me to follow the call of God on my life. But to be really honest with you, even to this day, it's still hard. It's still hard to live there and be away from my family. And they're very supportive, but we miss each other a lot.
And I think for you growing up Jewish, there was a natural side of, I'm going to go spend some time, study abroad in Israel. For my family, growing up with no Jewish identity, the idea of, you're going to go to the Middle East, and isn't that where there's terrorist attacks, and like you're really going to do that? And I kind of did the shock therapy with my parents and family. Like I just said, hey, I'm going to end up in Israel one day, and everyone's like, okay, yeah, of course, maybe. But then they see the process, and they saw God open door after door, and now you can't deny that there's purpose to being there. So I would say that it's not an easy place to live. Sometimes when you come on tour, you have a different experience. I didn't want that experience. So my first trip, when I came, I said, I don't want to go on a tour. I want to backpack across the country. I was 19 years old, staying in youth hostels, riding public transportation. I stayed 2 nights in a cave with a Bedouin in the Negev desert.
We didn't know each other at the time.
It was a very different experience than you have on most tours. But I wanted a little bit more of an authentic, live like a local kind of experience. And literally, I didn't know what I was doing. If you've ever been to Israel, I was like, there's Capernaum's here, and I'm on the Mount of Beatitudes. I'll just walk there. And I'm walking with headphones in, listening to Marty Goetz worship music, and just hearing from the Lord. So again, we're very different types of people. But seeing God's hand, seeing doors open for me originally to get a visa, and then later the ability to make Aliyah, which is a miraculous story in and of itself, just confirmed, I think, to our family that there's purpose to us living here.
Michael and I were actually the first people in our immediate family to have gone to Israel. And since then, our whole families have come to visit. It's neat to be able to walk in that.
That's awesome. You guys are the pioneers. So before you tell us about the process of making Aliyah, what was the step here, the straw that broke the resistance camel's back, we'll say, to I want to move to Israel, I'm thinking about it, I'm not sure to, I'm doing this for both of you?
Yeah, so I was actually working at a university that I had graduated from, and wrestling with the Lord because I was again just feeling that longing and feeling that pull. And so I had been just going back and forth with the Lord about it, and I just remember actually leading. I was leading a tour group of college students. And so this was the first big moment. I was leading a group of college students. We were doing every other day serving within different ministries and every other day touring. And I was driving around, and it's a different thing when you are welcoming people into the country and you're hosting them. Like, you have to own it a bit different. And I remember I was in a worship time in someone's home, and I was praying over the map of Israel and just interceding. And in that moment, God just said, "This is your home." And I just bawled my eyes out, and I just thought,
not happy tears.
yeah, I'm like, I don't know if I want this to be my home. And God just really kind of softly basically was leading me to, we're gonna work through this together. And it was a few years later, actually almost 3 years later, where I remember then I was back home and taking a walk around a lake and praying, "God, what is this next season for me? I know there's a transition coming up, but I don't know what's next." And he said, "It's time to go home." And again, bawling my eyes out. I don't want to go home. That's not my home. I have no desire to go and to leave my family and to leave what I am comfortable with and what I know. But it was so strong to the point where I felt like if I didn't go, it would be disobedience.
Good. I remember when I was on this trip, and I was in Jerusalem, staying at Abraham Hostel in Jerusalem, and we heard this noise outside on a Friday night. It was Shabbat, and I ran outside with my camera. I have my big DSLR camera, and we saw all these ultra Orthodox dressed up for Shabbat. You know, they got the big hats on, everything, right? They were outside of an Ethiopian restaurant that was there at the time that was open on Shabbat, and they were just yelling Shabbat, Shabbat, and they were protesting, and they were going back and forth, and there were kids screaming, and they were protesting this restaurant that was open on the Sabbath. And I was there filming the whole thing, and I just remember my heart was just so grieved for the level of, you know, I had experienced Shabbat as a life-giving thing, but seeing it lived out in such a legalistic, oppressive, even sometimes maybe a little bit abusive way, just having a heart for the, you know, not saying I hate these people, but saying, man, I want to be here, and if there's something I can do, if I can be part in some small way of helping to reach these people, that's what my heart is. So that was the moment for me.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, and we actually still wrestle with this, but the mentality, we've talked about this so many times, the mentality for Michael to have gone, it in some ways, because of the way that he was raised, it was almost like, even with his family and everything, he was a missionary in a way, like he was being sent to go, you know, to Israel. And then for me, people always say, "Oh, you're a missionary to Israel." I'm like, I'm not a missionary to Israel. Like I grew up Jewish, like it's part of what it talks about in the Bible, and God says that he is doing this. I had nothing to do with this. When he says he's going to do something, he says he's going to do something. And so anyways, we still sometimes kind of wrestle with it in regard to like, I'm living there and I get to do ministry. And for Michael, it's like he went there to do ministry. So.
And that's an interesting, you know, our audience may not understand but we talk about it so often in this podcast and so many of the episodes, Carly, maybe every episode, the idea that believing in Jesus for a Jewish person, somebody who grew up Jewish or has a Jewish heritage, isn't a departure from that identity. It's actually a fulfillment. And so the idea of a Jewish believer in Jesus moving to Israel, all of us, right, have a calling and a unique ministry that God's given us, and those things are irrevocable, Jewish or Gentile alike. And so we can express that calling in Israel, but Jewish believers moving to Israel aren't automatically going to be missionaries. They're going to be Jews living in the land that God promised the children of Israel, because his promises are irrevocable and his promises are forever. He's the promise-keeping God. So an important distinction our audience may not have considered, but if you haven't, consider it today.
So what was the actual process in making Aliyah? Like, what were the time frames, the milestones? What did that look like?
Yeah, so for me, I really came to Israel as a Gentile, and we've talked about this, as someone that was feeling a calling to engage with the Jewish people in Israel. But after moving to Israel very quickly, entered into ministry and co-founded this ministry called Firm, and now we get a chance to lead. But outside of that, I found out that my grandmother, who had passed away, had a Jewish heritage. It was hidden in our family. Only the women in the family knew. As far as I knew, I was as Italian as can be. I didn't even know there were Jews in Italy. Now I've learned so much. There's an Italian synagogue right next to where we used to live, and there's so much to learn. But I went on this trip with my father to meet family I had never talked to before or met before in Italy, dug up all of this evidence of my family's Jewish background. And I got advice from some lawyers. They said, this is next to impossible that you'd actually be able to use this information to immigrate to Israel. It's so hidden. It's so, you have a 2% chance of ever making Aliyah and immigrating. So my process was very different. Usually you need to get a letter from a rabbi. That's kind of the hardest thing to get. And so I got some advice saying, hey, start attending a congregation in Canada that, developing a relationship with that rabbi. And when, he wants to get to know you a little bit more, tell him the story and see if he write you a letter. And I didn't want to go back to Canada, so I had my dad start going to a Reform synagogue that I selected. He started attending for every couple months, and gave some money in the tzedakah. And at some point, the rabbi had a conversation, said, "Hey, let's have a meeting." It was a Reform rabbi, so he was having non-kosher sushi in the meeting. But I told my dad when the meeting was set, I flew over from Israel to Canada. We sat down with the rabbi, and I shared our story. And I said, look, I'm already living in Israel. I want to immigrate. I want to make my life there. And supernaturally, we were able to get a rabbi's letter. Supernaturally, we were able to file that process in Israel at the Ministry of Interior. And that's a tricky process. We didn't do it in Jerusalem. Jerusalem, because it's more religious, they're also more strict. They check to see if you are a missionary, if you are even if you're not a missionary, if you're a believer in Yeshua or in Jesus. They'll scour the internet. They hire anti-missionary organizations to do research to find out if there's anything online. So we have to take everything off the internet and purge out all the databases and everything like that. But miraculously, I was able to file, and within 6 weeks, I got my citizenship, which is a miraculous story. So again, I came to Israel as a Gentile, but I immigrated as someone with Jewish heritage. And for me, the most significant part of that is that God brought me back to Israel as he promised before I even knew I was Jewish. And now that's so meaningful.
So cool. The land and the people of Israel are forever connected. And I know that sounds maybe mystical or difficult to grasp for some of our audience, but I think it's a scriptural truth. It's a spiritual truth that God has knit the Jewish people, we see in the word, forever to a specific plot of land the size of New Jersey on the shores of the Mediterranean at the gateway to the Middle East. And Michael, it's awesome. You had this tractor beam, right, pulling you to a country that you couldn't explain why you loved. And then finally everything became clear because it's the land of your forefathers, though you didn't know it when the story began. Super cool.
We were actually dating at the time that he got his citizenship. And it was funny because I'm thinking, wait, I'm the one that grew up Jewish and you got your citizenship faster than I did. I had to go through a much harder process. And it was one of those moments of recognizing when God is doing something in your life and calling you to something, he is going to make a way in the right season at the right time. And for me, it's a very different, it's a very different story because I knew that I was Jewish and I knew the process basically that you have to prove your Judaism. So for both of us, actually, our Judaism comes from our father's side. And so that was also a new thing for me when I was first in Israel. Within the religious community, they would not consider us Jewish technically because technically it's through the mother, yet biblically it's through the father. So it's very interesting and depending on how you look at it. But our Judaism comes through our father. So with making Aliyah, which becoming a citizen, immigrating is, for us, it was as a descendant of a Jew, not technically as Jewish, but as descendants of Jews. And so through that process, for us, it was a little bit different. And so I had to go find out all the information from my father's side of the family. And I scooped up everything that I possibly could. And I came with piles and piles of paperwork, information of where our family was buried, my dad's bar mitzvah, circumcision, everything potential, marriage certificate, just proving we are Jewish here. I am supposed to become a citizen. And, mind you, this was also, I am walking out of obedience. God, you're telling me, I really feel led that you're leading me to do this. So I'm just going to do this out of obedience. And so I went to Israel with all this stuff, and also with a letter from a rabbi from my dad's synagogue that my grandparents actually helped start in New York. And my dad got bar mitzvah there. And so we got a letter from him, and I submitted it. And they said basically that this letter isn't good enough because the rabbi isn't on our rabbi's list. And so you need to go find another rabbi to write your letter. And I was like, I'm sorry, what? I mean, it was just this confusing thing.
You're telling me there's a rabbi's list?
I know.
They don't publish the list.
Yeah, right. And I'm thinking,
It's a secret list.
I don't have another rabbi to go find. This is where our Jewish roots were continued through my family. My grandparents were there. My dad was there. Like, what else am I supposed to go find? And so, long story short, we contacted the Board of Rabbis of New York and basically said, they're not accepting my letter, and this is our family history. This rabbi knows of our family. And so one of the people that was on the board of the rabbis basically said, I want to see if I'm on the list, so I'm going to write your letter myself. And so he was basically asking me, I remember he said, I just need to interview you. And so I sat with an interview with him, and he was asking me all of these questions just about my Judaism, how I actually walk out my Judaism. I remember one of the questions he just kept asking, well, are you involved in the Jewish community? What do you do? What synagogue do you go to? And I just remember, I really felt it was the Holy Spirit, because if they would have found out, or if he would have found out that I was a believer in Jesus and Yeshua, he would not have written my letter. And I remember just feeling like the Holy Spirit just really strongly I basically responded. I said, actually, they're not going to really care whether all these questions about me and my Judaism, they only care about my father, and they only care, and he grew up at this synagogue. So you're writing a letter based on all of that, and it really doesn't matter about all this. And immediately he goes, okay, great. I'll put your letter in the mail tomorrow. And that was it. And that was actually, though, a 6-month process for me in Israel. And I thought it was going to be a month to 2-month process for me. So by that time, 6 months later, I had a couple letters denied. All of my paperwork had been expired because you have to get background checks and all of these different things that you have to gather, and you have to get apostilles, which is official documentation that they can use internationally. And so all of that by then had expired. I had an internship that also, that time was up. And so I'm out of money. I was really homesick. I was having a really hard time. I was so frustrated with the bureaucracy of Israel and this whole proving my Judaism. And at some point I just said, I'm done. I didn't want this in the first place. God, you were the one who said to do this. And if you're not making it happen, I'm done and I'm going home. And literally, I just put it back on God. Like, you're the one that wanted this. If you want this to happen, I'm done and I'm leaving. And so you have to make it happen if you want anything to change. Literally 2 days later, I got a call after submitting the letter and everything. 2 days later, I got a call. You are received and you have your citizenship. You are now officially an Israeli citizen.
And you got your citizenship 2 days before you flew out of the country.
I was like, I'm still so exhausted emotionally with this process and mentally and everything. I just needed a break. So 2 days later, I got back on a plane to go back to America to breathe it out. And so it was a very, very heart-wrenching process.
Sure. But praise God, one that ended successfully, and the desire in both of your hearts to live in Israel was fulfilled. And what I want to point out for our audience here is two things that maybe our listeners are saying, wait a minute, I'm not following the details of the story here. Israel is a Jewish state. I mean, those who have heard Bibi Netanyahu when he was prime minister, he's no longer, but when he was, he would always emphasize that in his deep voice, to protect the Jewish state, and he'd speak before the UN. And so Israel's interest in receiving new immigrants is to really make sure, to the best of their ability, that people either are Jewish or have, as you said, a Jewish heritage, a Jewish parent or grandparent. So that explains a lot of the bureaucracy and the paperwork and the checking and the interviews that our audience may say, why is this so difficult? Why don't they just sign the form? You said you're Jewish. What's the issue? Well, that's the issue. But the second issue is, again, our audience, if you've heard other episodes, you'll understand this, but maybe this is new for some of you, is this idea that for the mainline Jewish community to believe in Jesus as the Jewish Messiah, as your personal savior, isn't seen as a fulfillment of a Jewish identity. It's seen as a departure from Jewish identity, Jewish ethnicity, Jewish heritage, the Jewish faith or religious system. And so Michael and Vanessa, in their own stories, had to handle that issue of faith in Jesus very carefully. And it sounds like pray a lot and trust the providence of God, who was calling them to Israel, to work that out. So the Jewish state that unfortunately right now, and if you're listening and you're a person of prayer, pray for a change in this in years to come, is generally resistant toward the idea of Jewish believers in Jesus immigrating and becoming citizens. So if that's new information for you, write to us. We'd love to share more details on that, but that's part of the context we just want our listeners to understand before we go on here and talk about life in Israel.
That's really good, Ezra. And it's important to understand, like, even the idea, the name Aliyah, the idea of ascending. It's this spiritual idea. I was dating Vanessa at the time. I could have gotten citizenship through a 5-year family reunification process once we were married. But there's something about actually that process of making Aliyah. It's not just a technical immigration process. And even the reason Israel put into law 2 years after the founding of the State of Israel, this law of return, they put the same requirements that Hitler had in the Holocaust. If you had a Jewish parent or a Jewish grandparent, 2 generations. And that's what they said. Even if you're not Jewish, if you have a Jewish parent or grandparent, you have a right to be able to return. So,
yeah, and unfortunately, just like you're saying, Ezra, not everyone is successful in their process. There are many people who apply and go through this heart-wrenching process. And at the end, if especially for the believing community, if they find out that they believe in Jesus, in Yeshua, then they are denied citizenship because the state of Israel believes that, even though it's a democratic state, they, like you said, believe that by believing in Yeshua, you are walking away from your Judaism, which is not possible. But so pray for there to be a change, like you said, because we want the justice of being able to rightfully be able to have everyone who has the Jewish heritage be able to come home.
Amen.
So for the only Gentile in the room here, if you become a citizen and then they find out later that you believe in Jesus, like, can they take away your citizenship?
So the typical answer is it's very hard once you receive citizenship.
Yeah.
But technically, if you immigrated under false pretense, so if you claimed that your mother was Jewish and they find out later that she was not Jewish, they can revoke your citizenship under that false pretense. Now, if you didn't lie about anything, but they find out you're a believer, there has been some talk about maybe there's 3 years or 5 years after you get your citizenship where maybe they can try to revoke it. I don't know that that's ever happened successfully. I know that they have tried that. We have some close friends, that they're trying right now to revoke their citizenship because they see what they do as missionary work in Israel. But again, it's much harder, and that's why we're even on this podcast and we're talking as openly as we can because we're citizens. If we were both on visas, it would be much more challenging to be able to talk about any sort of work preaching the gospel or sharing the gospel with Jewish people, because that's a lot more controversial.
But outside of them potentially, whether or not it's true or not that they can take away your citizenship, they can make your life horrible, in regard to the process that you go through of actually living there and getting ingrained within the culture and learning Hebrew and all of these things. You get a load of benefits when you do become a citizen, and they can pull back all of those. And so then you're just kind of on your own to figure out a whole new life in a whole new country. And so there are a lot of organizations that help the believing community, because if they do find out afterwards, then all of your benefits are frozen.
That's true.
So
because when you make Aliyah, there are benefits like you can import a shipping crate, tax-free. You have certain benefits when buying a new vehicle. You have certain free Hebrew lessons. So actually, we have a good friend of ours who he's born to an Israeli citizen. He's Israeli, but he moved to Israel with his family and with his 3 kids. And because they found out where he lives, because they found out that he lives in a Messianic community, they said, well, you do not have the right to return. Your family does not get citizenship. You're denied all of your benefits that they were counting on. And we make your process very, very difficult for your family over the next 5 years to actually get status. So he's paying taxes for his job, et cetera, and he's not getting any medical insurance for his family. Things like that just make it very, very difficult. And now they had another child born in Israel. That child's Israeli. He's Israeli, but his wife and other 3 kids are not Israeli. So it's just so confusing and complicated. Part of the challenge, and it's an emotional struggle as well. Saying, "Wow, my grandparents survived the Holocaust, and I have this Jewish identity. I feel this affinity for my people, and yet my people don't want me. They reject me, and to my face, they'd say, 'You're not even really one of us.'" And that's an emotional identity challenge that a lot of people have.
Right. And our purpose here, before Carly asked you a bit about the experience of living in Israel, our purpose isn't to vilify Israel as the Jewish state. Our purpose isn't to discourage people who are listening who have a Jewish heritage, who maybe have thought once, thought twice, think a lot about immigrating to the state of Israel. But as you said, Michael, confusing and complicated. And again, just underscoring that the issue of Jesus, as much as the Jewish community would attempt to sideline the issue, it is very much a hot button and a central issue. And if you believe Jesus is who he says he is, then you believe he's the fulfillment of everything God called Abraham out of Ur to be and to do and to fulfill. He's the Messiah. He's the one who makes it possible for Israel to be a blessing to all the families of the earth. If you don't believe that and you reject his messiahship, then you reject all those who receive him. And so it's a complicated thing, as we said, without going further down that road. We just want our listeners, if you have a Jewish heritage, it's complicated. You probably know it's complicated if you have a Jewish heritage. If you're a Christian listening, just appreciate that the Jewish believing community in Israel and in North America struggles to walk a fine line of identity. We believe it's a God-ordained line and he's in it, but it's a difficult road. So, but praise God, you guys are there now and you made it. And we're going to just talk a little bit about life in Israel as you've experienced it as millennials from a North American background.
So as you both explained your backgrounds, Vanessa, you're from the United States. Michael, you're from Canada, both first world countries, same with Israel. And English is one of the official languages of Israel. So our audience might be asking, how different is it really from North America to Israel? And what were some of the biggest surprises you experienced from living there?
This is a great question because Israel, especially if you look at the technology and the startup nation, a lot of aspects of our society are very first world. But then you actually look at the makeup of our country, 9.3 million citizens right now, and 70% of our citizens are either immigrants or they're the children or grandchildren of immigrants. So we're a nation of immigrants. And you got to ask yourself, where do these immigrants come from? Well, 1 million of the immigrants came from the former Soviet Union, came from communist, totalitarian regimes. And you have others that have immigrated from North Africa, whether Morocco or from Iran or from Iraq or some, you have some from Europe. So you have really this melting pot of a society that has all these different backgrounds, and it's reflected. You have Jews from Ethiopia, and it's reflected in our culture. So when we say first world, you would have no problem going to Israel and getting a really nice meal, a nice clean glass of water, an apartment with electricity. You might pay for it, but you might have no problem getting all of that. But in the mindset, in the way that our parliamentary system and a lot of our government offices are set up, there's a lot of bureaucracy that makes it very challenging, especially for someone from a first world. In fact, we were just having lunch with one of our neighbors, and he and his family immigrated from Russia. And I asked him, I said, is Israel more organized than Russia or less organized? And he said, actually, Israel is way more organized, way easier to understand. And I said, how funny the difference. For us coming from a first world background, it's so hard to get certain things done in Israel. You go to a bank and you think, I want to open a bank account. I'm your customer. You should try to win me over, not try to talk me out of getting a bank account and make it miserable and frustrating to actually open an account. So I think a lot of the differences is that idea of customer service, that idea of...
There's no concept of customer service in Israel.
There was one time one of the guys on our staff went to go get something printed, and he bought a USB stick to someone at a printing shop. We were paying them to print something, and they needed to redesign some graphic or change a font or something. And the designer on staff at the print shop looked at him and said, "Why should I work hard for you?" And he's like, because I'm your customer. I'm paying you to do it. Anyway, so that represents some of the hardness. And I think that is a challenge for people. If you just come on a tour and you're just staying in really nice hotels I mean, that's not what real life looks like. Going to the National Insurance Office, Pituach Leumi, or going to the Ministry of Interior and trying to navigate multiple languages and multiple mindsets and all different backgrounds that are brought in and trying to navigate a government, especially being an immigrant, it's not easy.
Yeah, and I think that everybody, like he's talking about, everybody comes from somewhere different. Everybody's there because of a different reason.
Yeah.
Like some people are there because their life was in danger somewhere else, and they're there for safety. They're there because they were fighting. This whole nation is created out of fighting for freedom, fighting for a place to call home. And so whether you're there and it's almost a sacrifice, based on where you came from, or it's your saving grace that you're there to, versus where you lived and your family from wherever they were from, everybody there is basically this group of enmeshed people fighting for a right to be at peace and to live in a place where they're not bothered and they're allowed to be who they are. And that when you actually put that into perspective, the ornery that you get from people, the standoffish, the hard shell that you get from people, most of Israel is walking through this post-traumatic stress of fighting, live in a place of without war.
Yeah.
And so it's as frustrating as so many things are. At the end of the day, you just, for me, I just have to ask God for extra grace to remember there's a reason that people are the way that they are, and that they need to be freed with the love of Yeshua. But at the same time, we're, also thinking, how can we help people to be able to have better customer service?
To let me open my bank account.
Right, exactly. And it's this weird thing of like, people are so rough around the edges, yet at the same time, if any conflict happens, there's also this warm family, like everybody sticks together kind of a thing. So it's this weird dichotomy that you deal with on an emotional level.
So you mentioned that, you really feel like, Vanessa, that your home is in Florida and you sometimes experience this homesickness still. How do you guys balance that or work within that, knowing that you feel like you're being obedient unto the Lord to be in Israel while also being homesick? I think, our audience, whether they're in Israel or not, everyone has that where they feel like, maybe I'm being obedient to something, but I still have a longing for something else. So kind of speak to that.
Yeah, I think for us, when we got married, an important thing for me at the time was to be married in Israel. Because we said, hey, this is where God's calling us to. This is our future. This is our future community. And even if it doesn't quite feel like home yet, this is where we're making our home to be. So we'll always have the country of origin. We'll always have the place that we came from. And there's certain comforts and luxuries that it's always going to feel familiar. But getting married in Israel, now having our son being born as a native-born Israeli, I think those are the things that cement for us that Israel is our home, even though there are times where you look back and you miss certain comforts and conveniences and certain things about home.
Yeah, Michael and I are very different, especially in regard to this. And I think I still struggle, with that reality of homesickness and family being away. And even especially now having a son who has to FaceTime to be with family. And, so I don't know. I think honestly, just being intentional about relationship is important. But at the same time, I think overall in life, I feel like we just are constantly grieving loss, and we're constantly grieving this process of I desire this and it conflicts with something else that I desire. And, at the end of the day, I want to be obedient to the Lord. And at the end of the day, I want to walk in what He has for me. And that is still hard to this day. And so as much as I am 100% confident to be there, it is still a very sad reality for me a lot of times. And I'm pretty sure there's not a goodbye that happens without tears when I'm with my family.
Sure.
Thank God for FaceTime, because
Yes.
that existed. I was actually, as you were talking about your wedding, I was just remembering how I had a watch party and
Yeah.
That's right. I remember that. Yeah.
That's right. No, and even having the wedding in Israel, we had this huge argument about it, thinking, I'm like, I can't get married there. What about all my other friends and family? Like, they're not all going to fly there. But it was a choice of, no, this is a decision that we're making to establish this is going to be our future home, and we're going to be there. But, the reality is people there have become like family to us, and that has been a beautiful part of the process as well. We have an incredible community there that we love, and we feel so supported with, and for us, unlike most people, for us, we don't have any other family members there. So when people are getting together for holidays or things like that, we're just kind of like, okay, which family are we going to join with this time? But God's really led us to incredible people, and so we're grateful for that.
Awesome. And you guys really are first generation immigrants. When we say that term, I think of, middle school history class, right? The immigrants came over, many of whom, my great-grandparents, namely, among millions of others from the old world Jewish communities, but they made their way and they immigrated, and they integrated into American society or Canadian society, and now here they are. But first generation immigrant status is still a thing in every generation, including for you guys as millennials. You're first generation immigrants going through the trauma of separation, the longing for the old country, which in our case is, Canada and America. But it's hard. It's a very real experience for hundreds of thousands, if not a couple million Israelis who themselves are first generation immigrants. So final question for you guys. You're Jewish believers in Jesus, and so you're part of what's called the Messianic Jewish community that exists around the world wherever there's a Jewish community, but of course inclusive of Israel as well, and specifically in the Jerusalem area. So you're called there, your calling, your ministerial expression is happening in Israel. What do you guys see as the future of the Messianic Jewish community in Israel? Whether that's 5 years out, 10 years out, between now and, when we believe Jesus comes back to rule and reign from Jerusalem. What's the outlook?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And I think to look forward, we kind of have to look back. And, over the last 70 years, the Messianic community in Israel has grown from 23 believers, literally 2 families that existed after the British mandate of Palestine, and they exited, and then Israel became a nation, to today, what some would say is 30,000 or more. We don't know what that's like. And I think today, when you ask the question, what do I see for the future? I see I see us as a believing body starting to lead in new aspects and areas of society. I see a level of boldness in our generation in Israel, standing on the shoulders of our parents and our grandparents' generation that really were the pioneers, that really said, hey, we're going to exist and we're going to be a relevant part of society. And I think today, people aren't debating whether Messianic Jews are a part of society in Israel. They may still not like us. They may still not prefer us or feel comfortable, but there's an acknowledgement. There's articles in the newspaper acknowledging who Messianic Jews are, and they're Messianic Jewish believers, and they're here in the land. They're here to stay. I think that's just such a picture of what it's like in Israel. If you could just remain for a certain amount of time, they'll try to get you out at first, but once they realize you're not going anywhere, they'll learn to accept you. Mm-hmm. And I hope we can go from acceptance to leading, to making an impact, to finding areas in society where our people that are not believers are leading, whether that's entrepreneurials and startups or social causes and areas that are making an impact on society. How great would it be to see believers enter into areas of influence? And even this week, I heard a story, a Messianic soldier in the IDF got publicly affirmed and awarded for his exemplary service. And this is something 70 years ago, 50 years ago, 30 years ago would not have happened. That they would publicly be awarding and acknowledging a Messianic officer in the IDF. And so I just think that we're going to see more and more of that, where we don't have to shy back. We don't have to be afraid that we believe in Yeshua. In fact, we can actually be bold and confident and know that we're adding value to our people and our society.
Yeah, and with that question, the one word that I think about is hope. I have hope for the Messianic Jewish community in Israel and around the world. And I feel like our generation has different opportunities and we're a lot more comfortable in our own skin with it, I think, at this point, to where, like Michael said, aside from the government, most people just are fine with us being believers, our neighbors or whatever. Like we don't go and broadcast it on our balcony, but we're nice. We love, for us, it's a matter of, hey, how do we love each person we come in contact with? And just allow God to be God and to do what he does. And so the opportunities to really share and walk out and be the hands and feet of Jesus are so much stronger, I think, today, in a lot more of a freeing way. So I'm very hopeful.
Hope, leadership, and impact. Those are some pretty exciting things to shoot for. And we're believing God, right? That if we really believe, which we do, all of us, the Carly representing the Gentile Christian community and the other three of us on today's episode representing the Messianic Jewish community, if we really believe that all the promises of God are yes in Yeshua, in Jesus, the Jewish Messiah and the Savior of the world, then we should absolutely believe that those in the Jewish community calling upon his name, filled with his Spirit, to be a blessing to all the families of the earth and to our own Jewish people, have a hopeful, a bright future ahead, and that God would use us to make a tremendous impact in Israel and in the nations. So it's exciting times. Guys, thank you so much.
Thank you,
Michael and Vanessa Mistretta, for sharing your story. And I've learned a lot. I know our audience has as well. Thanks for being vulnerable with us about the ups and downs, the hard lessons learned, and the awesome things the Lord did in and through you guys in becoming citizens of the land and the state of Israel. This has been a full episode, and we encourage you to check out others like it wherever you access your podcast content, or directly from our website at aJewandAGentileDiscuss.org. And I want to invite you again to stand with some hurting Jewish communities. Your investment in what we're doing through partner ministries around the world, in Israel as well as in Ethiopia, Zimbabwe, and other places where scattered Jewish communities live, can make a tremendous impact. And as a thank you for that investment, we want to send you some Ethiopian coffee from our very own Lost Tribes Coffee Company. If you want to enter into a drawing to win some free Lost Tribes coffee, here's what you do. Text JG to 474747. Again, JG to 474747. And all the details about becoming more engaged with us through this podcast and our partner ministries are online at JewandAGentileDiscuss.org. So tune in for more episodes, and thank you so much for joining us today. This show is a production of Jewish Voice Ministries International.